Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I participated in a boardroom lunch with CEDA earlier this year, and I found it really useful from my perspective, being Chief Executive of a international non-government organisation that's focusing on aid. I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal people and the Jagera people, traditional owners of the land, and to pay respects to elders past and present. I also congratulate the team on the production of the report. I think it's really timely, and it's amazing, isn't it, how the launch of this report, how they've lined up the Prime Minister to make significant comments on further aid into the region, and how they've lined up the Foreign Minister to be heading off to China. So we really want to get to know your public engagement team, Caitlin. They're obviously cracking at what they do. So I really want to give you a perspective from where we see our neighbourhood working with partners in many of the countries that certainly in the Pacific and in the Indo-China region. And just to kind of give you the snapshot, Oxfam is an international aid organisation. We're part of a global organisation, so we have a presence in 90 countries across the world. And we really have, I guess, three pillars to our work. We are very involved in humanitarian response, and that varies from the climactic events to the sad conflict events. So in many of the trouble spots in the world, including places like Syria, and certainly part of the Rohingya response in Bangladesh. We have long enduring relationships in terms of long-term development in many countries, and our preferred model of operation is working with partners rather than delivering services to those countries. But we also believe that if you want to get sustainable change, that you actually have to look at what are the systemic issues that have to be addressed. And so we see ourselves as trying to tackle systemic issues at a global level, at a local level, and trying to advocate for solutions in cooperation with the communities that we work in. And the thing that we feel is very important is that we work with communities rather than doing things for them. And to that end, Caitlin, I really want to commend you for the observation that the second State of the Nation report will actually be done with the Pacific, because you're quite right. We need to kind of move away from our sense of being the colonial saviours to actually thinking about where are the partnerships and the commonalities. And there are so many important perspectives that come from our Pacific partners one way or the other. So I think we're all approaching this issue looking at, what are the key kind of drivers for what our contribution, whether we're civil society, whether we're a company, whether we're a government, in terms of what the relationship with the Pacific would be. And from Oxfam's perspective, there are really four things that we think are really pretty big challenges that need an integrated response. So the first is the inequality gap, and CEDA did some work on inequality earlier on this year and produced a report. But basically the gap between the rich and the poor in our region and across the world is actually making the challenge of people who live in poverty much harder to tackle. And so as part of the problem analysis, we actually say, let's be clear that there is a gap a growing gap between the richest and the poor. There's a concentration of wealth, and that's not going to be solved by aid or trade. That's going to be solved by other responses that are around taxation, around global reform, around issues to do with money laundering and so on. The second really big challenge we think is around just what we would see as the closing civil society space. And that's really critical in the Pacific, because ultimately if there is any sustainable change into the future, then the voices of all parts of the system have to be heard. And if voices of civil society are being locked down, then there's a really important perspective that's not being heard. Globally, we're all really concerned about the massive displacement of people, and you would have heard the figure that there are 65 million people displaced globally at the moment. And again, for our near neighbours, that's a critical issue. People are displaced because of the impact of climate change, because of migration work patterns, sometimes because of unrest and discrimination. So that's the third really big issue. And the last one, which we think is one of the biggest barriers to poverty alleviation, is actually climate change. And again, what we've seen in the State of the Nation report is a recognition that anything that is done in response to climate change has to deal with adaptation and mitigation, but it also has to be linked with a holistic response to what's happening in communities that experience climate change. So it's pretty challenging, and from our perspective, we feel very privileged to work with communities, and we really need to bear in mind that at the heart of any work that Australia does as a government, as a private sector player or as a civil society player, that there are people, there are families, there are children, there are points of view, there are dignified ways of living that may be foreign to us that we need to be really respectful of and take into account. So what are the opportunities? One of the, I want to start with one that, from our perspective, we've really, I guess, interested in developing, and that's the critical role of the private sector in actually addressing issues around poverty alleviation. And we think the private sector is a really important partner in anything that's done from Australia into countries in our region. Oxfam is often seen as being a bit of an attacker of the private sector, which is not the case at all. But what we try to do is to work with the private sector to actually understand what impact they can make that might be different. The most current piece of work that we're involved in is actually not so much in the Pacific, but with our Asian neighbours, and it relates to the garment industry coming out of Bangladesh and Vietnam and China. And we've worked with the retail industry in Australia to look at not only the standards of garment workers who live in below the poverty line, particularly in Bangladesh, but also to try to work towards actually Australian companies demanding that their contractors pay a living wage to these garment workers. We were really pleased that we were able to work with Deloitte Access Economics, a very credible economic consulting firm, to look at what it would actually cost if you added to the value of the production of a T-shirt in Australia, if you were able to guarantee the flow-on effects to garment workers in somewhere like Bangladesh. And the economic modelling is actually extraordinary. So if we look at a $10 T-shirt, about 40 cents of that goes towards the wages of workers. And if you actually wanted to pass on the cost, if you like, to get a living wage, then it really only adds another 10 cents to the cost of a garment. And the reason we did that modelling was to actually demonstrate that the private sector, with very little impact on its actual bottom line in terms of margins of costs, can really look at the ethical sourcing of where it's working in countries where people are living in poverty and where there are benefits that are coming back to Australia. So the garment industry in Australia is a $27 billion industry, but where it's possible to actually ensure that the supply chain is really, really important. So that's one great opportunity that we see, and I think the private sector increasingly is looking for opportunities to actually understand the impact of actually meeting their shareholders' requirements whilst they're working in these countries in our region. I've also talked about inequality being one of the challenges, and I think that this is now being recognised not only by CEDA but by the IMF and by the Pope and by various other international bodies as a really critical issue that's trapping people, I guess, in poverty. And you would have seen some of the statistics. 82% of the wealth generated last year went to the richest 1% of the global population. And whilst that's happening, there are still 3.7 billion people who are living in poverty. And from our perspective, that means that the targeting of the Australian aid budget is really critical in actually reaching those people who are most marginalised and who are trapped in that poverty trap, and who, where it's really hard to get. So poverty alleviation we see as a really critical policy plank in terms of how Australian aid is actually utilised. I've mentioned a bit about civil society, and obviously that's important in the Australian context, and actually it's a pretty challenging environment in Australia at the moment in terms of the role of civil society, because there are various pieces of regulation around foreign donations where the charity sector has been caught up, around foreign operatives where the charity sector's been caught up, and we should be accountable. We raise money from the generosity of the Australian community and we want to be accountable. But we also want to be able to operate in a level playing field. But in some of the countries that we're operating in, we see that the voices of organisations that form part of civil society are really being dampened down. And it means that the avenue to actually tap into the sentiment of a community is lost. That what you have is the filter of a government view or a business view without the real experience of people being fed into what the consideration is. And we think that's dangerous. We've heard in the State of Our Neighbourhood report the concern about economic nationalism. I think that we're also concerned about global nationalism in both Western countries and developing countries. And as that occurs and as countries kind of look in on themselves and their own interests, there needs to be a way to kind of open up that dialogue. And if you bear with me, if I just quote the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, who said, if leaders do not listen to the people, they will hear from them in the streets, the squares, or, as we see far too often on the battlefield. There is a better way, more participation, more democracy, more engagement and openness, and that means maximum space for civil society. And certainly one of the concerns from the places that we work around the world, and I think we're also seeing this in the Western countries as well, is the lack of confidence in institutions to address the kind of concerns that people who live day-to-day lives are facing. The most explicit of that, I think, is the Me Too movement, and my own organisation and our own sector has been caught up in the fact that I think women and people who have felt harassed and exploited aren't confident that institutions can give them solutions, and those movements will come and rise up in response to that. Now, I do want to just kind of finish with a couple of comments about the role of Australian aid. And it won't come as any surprise to you, Philip, if I said that we're very disappointed by the successive cuts to the aid budget. It is worth noting just a couple of statistics for when you have your dinner party conversations and when people say, why are we funding into the Pacific? Why aren't we funding the drought-stricken farmers? Or, you know, those kind of conversations that we have, that less than 1% of government expenditure is actually spent on overseas aid. There's all sorts of other assistance that comes to countries overseas, but the actual proportion of overseas aid that's spent is a very small part of overall government expenditure. And as we'll hear, I think, from Denise's presentation, and as I can assure you, for the small proportion of the aid budget that organisations like ours take, a dollar makes an enormous difference in the countries we're working in. And if Australian aid is used effectively, then it's used to actually try to address this issue of poverty alleviation. And then it spirals into all of those other interesting discussions about, is it in our interests to make sure that people aren't living in poverty in a region? And is it being used to actually bolster the kind of capacity, build the capacity with countries so that they can become sustainable in their own right? And is it possible that the good utilisation of Australian aid will actually lead to sustainability in those countries and people feeling that they can determine a direction for themselves? So certainly today's announcement by the Prime Minister is welcome. It's welcome to have increased attention into the Pacific. We're never going to outspend China in infrastructure, so I think Australia has to be really clever about how it uses its aid in the Pacific region and how we build up the relationships with our Pacific partners. But we are concerned that what happens is that an ever-diminishing pool of money that's used for Australian aid is reshuffled rather than expanded, which is what we would like to see happen, where we can get to some sort of respectable level in terms of what Australia's contribution as a relatively rich country is, not only to the region, but to some of the trouble spots in the world. I mentioned at our table, I've just come back from Lebanon. Lebanon has a population of 4 million people. In addition to that 4 million people, there are 2 million refugees. Now imagine that proportionality in our country and how we'd be coping with that. Australian aid goes to helping some of those refugee programs. We're a small partner, but an important partner, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we've got a role to play in some of those conflicts as well. So, to finish on a positive note, there have been enormous gains that have been made globally. We've cut global poverty in half in the last 10 years. We've doubled the number of people who have access to clean water, and we've dramatically reduced the number of children dying every year. But there's a really big job to be done, and I guess increasingly from where I sit and looking out into the world, I think that's a job for all players. It shouldn't be left just to governments in terms of overseas aid. It should certainly be encouraged that governments play an integrated role, as we've heard about today, that it's not just the delivery of aid, it's about the development of economic relationships and building the capacity in areas of governance and civil society. And ideally it should be about Australia playing a strong role in leadership on the global stage in terms of the protection of human rights for many of the communities that we work in. And the private sector, I think, increasingly has got a very positive contribution to play in this space. And the more that we can find ways to find the areas of agreement and commonality and try to work together, I think the more likely we are to see some improvements in the quality of life for many of our neighbours who are such a short distance away. So that's my perspective from Oxfam. I look forward to the Q&A, I think. But can I invite Denise now to the stage to give us a really exciting example of the work that's being done in the Pacific. Thanks very much.